Welcome to Lecture 2 for Topic 7, the Presidency. As we know, there are several sources of presidential power: constitutional, institutional, and the contemporary expansion of presidential power. Today, in this lecture, we're going to talk specifically about the constitutional powers of the presidency. In the last lecture, we talked about the different categories of constitutional power: expressed, delegated, implied, and inherent. In this lecture, we're going to talk specifically about express powers. And these are the powers that come from Article 2, Section 2, and Section 3. And there are different categories or hats. So there's the goofy, image there that one way of thinking about the presidency is that the president wears many different hats. Our system is kind of unique because as you'll see in your textbook, that other countries divide sort of the president or that the individual, that they don't have one individual that assumes all of these different powers, right? In parliamentary systems, you have like a prime minister who's the head of government, and then you have like a queen or a king or some sort of monarch that acts as the constitutional head of state, which is engaged with sort of diplomatic and symbolic representations. They sort of like are the symbolic head of that nation. In the United States, we combine those into one. We have sort of a dual presidency. So our president is both the head of government, but also is the head of state. And it leads to many different hats that the president wears. So in this lecture, we're going to look at specifically the different categories of those hats. We're going to look at the military, judicial, diplomatic, executive, and legislative express powers of the presidency. So let's go ahead and get started. The military powers of the president. The military powers are probably among the most important powers that are exercised by the President of the United States. The Constitution tells us that the president is the commander-in-chief. And this makes the president basically the highest military authority in the United States. And keep in mind that this is a person who's not a member of the military. It's the highest. A civilian is placed as the highest military authority in the United States. And the power is quite vast. That the president has control over the entire defense establishment. That would include the military itself, as well as the National Guard, but also the intelligence networks that make up the defense establishment in the United States. And so the president is for all practical purposes, the head of the CIA, right? That the CIA answers to the president, as does the National Security Council, as does the FBI and the National Security Agency. And so the commander-in-chief power is quite vast. Your textbook talks about that the commander-in-chief power also leads to the president serving as and playing a role in the domestic military power. A lot of times when we think about military power, we think about exercising that power overseas, internationally. But the commander-in-chief role also applies to what takes place in the United States. And so when it comes to the domestic military power, it's related to Article 4 in the Constitution. And so Article 4 tells us that the United States will protect states from invasion and domestic violence. And as the commander-in-chief, that job ultimately falls to the president of the United States. Oftentimes, that this is the domestic military power will be exercised to help out a state that's experiencing some sort of emergency situation: wildfires, a hurricane, a flooding like during Hurricane Katrina. And usually the federal military will help out states when the governor or the state legislature asks for that help. However, that's not always the case. As your textbook points out, that if a state is ignoring a judicial order, as was the case in 1957 when the state of Arkansas refused to desegregate its high schools and other schools, the President Eisenhower mobilized the national forces, the federal military, in order to assist in the desegregation of the high schools. And so, again, the military power is quite vast. Keep in mind that we do have checks and balances when it comes to military power. Congress has the power to declare war. Presidents cannot declare war, but the president presides over the military. And in fact, under the War Powers Resolution that you will read about in your textbook, the president has the authority to mobilize troops to deal with an international crisis without the approval of Congress. That's not regarded as declaring war. But then the president needs to come back after a specified period of time to get the approval of Congress. So that's just sort of a summary of the military powers of the president. Students often confuse the judicial powers of the presidency with the power to appoint federal judges. And even though the president does have that power, it does not fall into the category of judicial powers. Judicial powers are the powers that the Constitution grants the president to basically act as the chief judicial officer of the United States. In other words, the power to grant pardons and reprieves are that is this power that's given to the president for them to basically act as a judge. It's this unilateral power. Granting a pardon is basically if a person has been convicted of a federal crime or might be convicted of a federal crime, you can sort of do it preemptively. You can pardon a person from that charge of the crime. And so it basically scrubs if you have been charged and tried and found guilty and you're pardoned, it just scrubs it from your record. It's like it never happened. A reprieve is that where the conviction would still be on your record, but the sentence you received you would get a reprieve from it, and so that the sentence could be completely commuted or reduced. And the thinking is and keep in mind that this power is unconditional. And so that the Constitution tells us that the president has this power, but there's no check or balance on it. And so if the president wants to pardon, commute, or reprieve somebody, they can do it. They don't need anybody to, check over what they're doing and give them some sort of approval. Now, there is a tradition that when presidents grant pardons and reprieves, there is a certain process that is supposed to be followed. But again, it's just a tradition or a norm. Generally, people will ask the President of the United States for a pardon or reprieve, and then the President will turn those requests over to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice will give the President some guidance on how the President should proceed. And then usually the President takes those that guidance and acts accordingly. But there's no mandate to do that, and presidents often or sometimes do not do that because it is a sort of unilateral power that is given to the President of the United States. You might be thinking, what did the framers have in mind? Why did they give the president the power to grant pardons and reprieves? There were two reasons for this. One was you wanted to be able to correct injustices, right? The Justice Department and the workings of the justice in the courts, it's not perfect. There are errors that are made. And sometimes people are convicted for political reasons. And so early on in our country's history, that when there was a rise of political parties, the Federalist Party was upset by what the Democratic Republican Party was saying about the Federalist president, John Adams, in their newspapers. And so they passed the Alien and Sedition Act, and then they used that act to punish people who were engaging in political speech. When Thomas Jefferson, who was a part of the Democratic Republican Party, came into office, he granted pardons for those who have been convicted under the Alien and Sedition Act. A more recent example of this would be the correcting of injustice of the long sentences that people have received for federal drug crimes. Both President Obama and President Trump have commuted sentences for those who have been convicted or sentenced to unjustly long terms. There's also a sense that the pardon and retrieve power relieves pressure that might have built up in our nation that's a cause of continued tension and making it difficult for a country to move forward. President Ford pardons Nixon of the potential crimes he could have been charged with associated with the break-in at the Watergate, because there was a sense that he wanted us to move on as a nation. And Jimmy Carter pardoned Vietnam draft dodgers who had avoided the draft and went and lived in Canada because they didn't want to be convicted of draft dodging. And so he pardoned them so that they could come back and join the community. And so that's some of the reasons behind granting the president these powers. The president, as head of state, has diplomatic powers. So these are the president is deemed as the head of state. That means that they are basically the person who represents the United States abroad. Sometimes the president will send somebody in his or her place, but ultimately the president is the head of state and does that job. And so presidents will, when they receive ambassadors or public ministers or other heads of states, when they come to the United States, that they might have a big state dinner, sort of welcoming the head of state from France or the president of China or wherever it may be. They would welcome them with a big state dinner, just sort of forging this diplomatic relationship that we have with those other countries. If there is ever an instance where there's like a coup in a foreign government, or if there's some question about which group in a foreign government is the legitimate foreign, whether who's legitimate in terms of who has power, the president will recognize that this group as holding the legitimate authority to govern over a foreign country. And that's a big deal. If a president doesn't recognize a country as legitimate, the head of state is legitimate, right? Then that sends a message to the community of nations. And so these are just some examples of the diplomatic powers of the president. Also, it includes treaties, executive agreements, etc., that you'll read about in the textbook. It is the executive powers where we find the powers that the president has to appoint people to office and also to nominate justices to the federal court. The executive powers is that the president is basically the chief executive officer of the executive branch of government. And as such, the buck sort of stops with the president, so that the president is vested with the powers to execute law. And so if law doesn't get properly executed, then the chief executive officer is held accountable for that. And like chief executive officers, then they pick their team who they want to work with. And so the president appoints and removes and supervises all executive officers that work within the executive branch. And so you'll be reading in your textbook about the cabinet. And the cabinet is the secretaries of all the federal departments that we have within the federal bureaucracy. So the Department of State, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Defense, etc. All of those are headed by an individual that is known as a secretary, so the Secretary of State. And the president is the one who appoints those individuals with the approval of the Senate, but they also can remove those people as well, as we've seen during the course of the Trump presidency. He'll appoint people and he'll remove them as well. And then also within the executive powers is the tremendous power of nominating justices to the federal bench. And as we basically taped this yesterday, the new Justice Amy Coney Barrett has been appointed to the United States Supreme Court to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died about a month ago. And so the president nominated her. She was confirmed by Senate, and then she was sworn in yesterday and then again this morning. So all of those are examples of that executive power. The last hat that the president wears is the legislative powers. And so the legislative powers is the president is ultimately sort of the chief like lawmaker in the United States. And this is encapsulated in the Constitution in many places. That one, the president has veto power. And so, as we stated in a previous lecture, that the bill is passed by both houses of Congress, but it doesn't become law until the president actually signs it into law. And the president has the power to veto and will sometimes exercise that veto pen. The president is, in the Constitution, tells us that the president will make a State of the Union from time to time. And this is often where the president will, today, the way it plays itself out, that once a year, the president will make a State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress, to both the House and the Senate. And it's often here where the president will lay out their legislative agenda, the legislative initiatives that they want Congress to pick up and enact. It's easier to do when both of the houses of the Congress are in the same party as the president, but good presidents can, work across the aisles. President Bill Clinton, good example of that is that as a Democrat, he worked with conservative Republicans to do welfare reform, which usually that's not really seen as welfare expansion, is sort of seen more in the wheelhouse of Democrats. But President Clinton reformed our welfare system. It's a good example of that enactment of the legislative agenda across party lines. And then also you'll read about these things called executive orders. And you'll learn about in your textbook about how executive orders were supposed to be just used in emergency situations. But these days, when the president can't get things done because there is gridlock with Congress, the president will exercise their executive order power. And what an executive order is that it's a way that the president can kind of pass an order that applies to either the executive branch of government or relates to a law that's already on the books, and that it allows the president to basically sort of enact law as long as it finds its authority in an existing piece of federal legislation or in an express power within the presidency in the Constitution. I'll let you read more about the executive orders in the textbook, but some good examples of it would be like Truman in 1948 passed the executive order 9981. They're all numbered. And this was an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. As commander in chief, he had that authority, and he used an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you later.